This is a land where the weak are enslaved and killed. Violence is every man's daily bread, and a dead husband is every woman's dream. Here children expect to be beaten for their own good, sometimes to death. This is the fabled warrior kingdom of Sparta. Soon it will be the unlikely savior of the free world. The cradle of Western civilization is under attack. King Xerxes and his 250,000-strong Persian army are invading Greece. In the first major struggle between East and West, the slave-owning Spartans and their king Leonidas will be transformed into glorious heroes. Over the next 2,500 years, their heroic stand will become a legend. The Spartans at the gates of fire. This is Termopilska, the scene of one of the most glorified slaughters in history. Many thousands died here. The smell of death and decay still hangs in the air as sulphurous hot springs pour their stench down the mountainside. Given the battlefield its name, Termopilska, the hot gates, the gates of fire. A solitary figure surveys the battlefield. One of the greatest heroes of antiquity, the Spartan king, Leonidas. Here Leonidas took on the might of the Persian Empire with just a tiny Greek defense force and stopped it in its tracks. Legend says that Leonidas' struggle against King Xerxes saved Western democracy at the very moment of its birth.
The minute it happened, it immediately vaulted into legend. We look back 2,500 years and it seems ancient, it seems mythological to us. We can't even tell if it's real or if it, but it really happened. It was a historical event. We know who was there, we know the names, it really happened.
But with Termopilska, few facts are certain. Almost all we know about the battle and the Spartans themselves comes from the ancient historian Herodotus, writing from a Greek perspective more than 40 years after the battle.
Herodotus was responding to stories that he was told by the Spartans when he visited Sparta. And the Spartans had already put together their version of events by the time Herodotus came to write his history. And the Spartans had, had time to chew it over, had time to lionize Leonidas, had time totally to heroize the Spartan achievement. So Herodotus himself was gathering a partly mythologized version.
Whatever the truth, the legend of the Spartans at the Battle of Termopilska reverberated down the ages. Historians and artists transformed Leonidas and his men into mythical figures until their battle for Greece became seen as a fight for the entire Western world.
In the Western imagination, the story of Termopilska is the most important example of heroic self-sacrifice for country. The simple message is that it's better to be dead than unfree.
Leonidas came from a secretive and violent society, totally at odds with the rest of Greece. Their presence at one of the key battles for freedom has intrigued Western scholars for centuries.
For 2,500 years, people have been arguing about them, never agreeing as to who they were, what they did, why they did it. The Spartans have left a wonderful mythical paper trail that nobody has really succeeded in sorting out.
Today, very little remains of Sparta, the most isolated and secretive city-state in ancient Greece. But in Leonidas's time, this remote valley was home to the most feared warriors in the Mediterranean. Two and a half thousand years ago, Greece was not a single nation. Sparta was the most fiercely independent of 1,500 feuding city-states. And unlike other Greeks, who spent most of the year farming, all Spartans were full-time warriors.
Every time you faced the Spartan army, you faced a mass of identically, perfectly trained Spartans. You were not really confronting even mortal man. You were confronting sort of this eternal notion of unbeatable Sparta.
Leonidas was master of his own realm and feared in many more, but his supremacy was about to be challenged. Persia was the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. From its center in modern-day Iran, it stretched from India to Egypt. Greece was just a tiny speck on its western horizon.
Persia was a world empire. It included 28 nations. It had all the resources it ever wanted. It had all the money it ever wanted, and controlled something that nobody before them had ever controlled.
The Persians looked like they could take over the world, but it would be some years before they realized that they would have to get past the Spartans first. In Sparta, Persia would find a military machine like no other. Closed to the outside world, Sparta's people thought they were a chosen super race. And with extreme laws and ideals, they planned to stay that way.
The Spartans had an ideal of being similar. They in fact called themselves the similars. They wanted to be the same in their military training, the same in their style of life. The whole way of life of the Spartans is a commitment to a kind of duty to the state, all really under an umbrella commitment to absolute discipline, to never being different from any other Spartan.
To maintain discipline, everyone in Sparta was always under surveillance. A group of ultra-conservative old men called the Gerousia looked for signs of non-conformity. Watching the Gerousia was another group of officials, the Ephors. Even royalty wasn't above suspicion.
A Spartan king wasn't a monarch. It was a diarchy. There were two of them, carefully watching each other, being rivals, and knowing that if they stepped out of line, the Ephors might get them. The king could be put on trial, could be exiled, and his character systematically ruined in the eyes of history.
No one escaped Sparta's judgmental gaze. All babies were examined to check that they conformed to the Spartan ideal. Even Prince Leonidas would have been tested.
If you failed the physical test, that is, you were born into a family and you had an obvious glaring defect, whether that was being lame or blind or deaf, you would be killed, exposed, thrown into a crevice or off a mountainside, and that would be the end of your existence.
Exposure was common throughout ancient Greece, but the Spartans took it to extremes.
Children were exposed not only because they were deformed, but because the parents couldn't bring them up. And the thought was that they would be picked up, they would be brought up, they wouldn't just die. But in Sparta, they absolutely took the view that deformed infants, or infants which even showed some signs of weakness, were to be hurled down a chasm not far from Sparta and literally killed.
Once declared healthy, Leonidas, like every other young child, immediately began his lifelong duty to the state.
A Spartiate boy or a Spartiate girl expected that they would be, in modern terms, nationalized. They belonged to their community.
At the age of 7, a boy would have been removed from his family and taught the Spartan ways.
Young Spartans were brought up and educated communally by the state from, we're told, the age of 7. And this education was intended to inculcate physical toughness, military skill, and above all, obedience.
Living together in barracks, the boys learned comradeship. And deprived of all comforts, they were molded into austere Spartans through extreme physical hardship.
A person from a very early age would have to learn to hunt. He would go barefooted. He would have to learn to survive on his own in the wilds.
The boys were deliberately given not enough to eat, and also they were encouraged to steal to augment their meager rations, and they were whipped if they were caught. Not because stealing was a crime, but because they were clumsy thieves.
The eyes of Sparta were everywhere. When a boy reached puberty, he was considered to be particularly dangerous.
The boys were always supervised, every moment of every day. Spartans felt that boys, teenagers, were at a particularly dangerous age. They might go off the rails. They had to be policed every minute to make sure that the values of the ruling group were transmitted.
Spartan girls were given some sort of formal education, and they had some sort of exercise, allegedly naked in front of the boys. The aim being for them to be, when they married, and they married late by Greek standards, educated, brought up in such a way as to be able to survive the rigors of childbirth. Ideally, they gave birth to boys, because Sparta was a fundamentally military society. So the whole system is geared to producing the largest number of physically fittest fighting males.
One of the things that always amazes me is that they ever managed to produce any children, because they were encouraged to go into sort of military homosexual relationships until they were allowed to marry.
The Spartans might well be fighting next to their boyfriends. Homosexuality was thought to bind men to their peers. It was your job, with your shield and your spear, to guard your lover. That was part of the cement that kept the Spartan battle line together. Homosexuality was very common in Sparta and was positively looked on, provided it didn't stop men breeding.
The Spartan population was perilously small, and so there were laws designed to spice up the sex lives of married couples.
A Spartan man wasn't allowed to see his wife in daylight for the first 10 years or so of their marriage. A man was encouraged to see his wife as a splendid sex object. Emotional development was something they didn't want, because families were the source of peculiarity. Spartans wanted to produce similars. They wanted them wheeling on the battlefield with one mind, like a flock of birds.
Aged 20, Leonidas, like all Spartan young men, joined the ranks. His duty? To fight for Sparta until he was 60 or dead. Each boy would have been given Sparta's trademark red cloak, the only uniform in Greece, designed to hide blood, either his own or that of his victims. Leonidas would also have had to obey the Spartan rule to grow his hair into long locks.
Sparta's hair was meant to intimidate. It was long, it bristled. These were Spartan dreadlocks. They were for the enemy to dread. When someone looked at a Spartiate, they were meant to draw a message about Spartan society. This man is terrifying. Look at the size of him, the length of his hair, blood-red color of his cloak. Look at the rest of them there too, calling attention to themselves, masters of the universe.
The Spartans' reputation hinged on their mastery of hoplite warfare, the Greeks' unique form of combat. They made formidable opponents. The Spartan phalanx, a line of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, bristling with spears and protected by overlapping shields. Whilst other Greeks were undisciplined amateurs who charged into battle, the Spartans were more cool-headed.
The Spartan reputation in hoplite warfare was formidable. It was based a lot on psychological terror. They were apparently the only hoplites that did not run. They walked to battle to the music of flutes. That seemed to terrify their opponents. We have instances where entire armies ran at the onset.
In the confusion of battle, Spartan training and discipline came into its own. Their mastery of phalanx maneuvers allowed them to move in unison on command. A Spartan warrior was trained to be comfortable with death. Bloodbaths were his profession. City-states that took on the Spartans expected to suffer. Sparta's elite warriors were the pinnacle of their society. But they were permitted few possessions apart from their weapons. Their warrior code rejected all luxury in favor of austerity and self-deprivation. Even their food was notoriously grim. But the Spartans were conditioned to like it that way.
Spartans had what the richest people of any society have. They had the highest status imaginable, and that will compensate for almost any physical deprivation. Other Greeks might think that being wealthy would help them, but they wanted to be wealthy to achieve high status, and the Spartans had achieved that anyway.
Sparta's invincible military reputation had been built up by conquering the surrounding lands of Messenia and Laconia and turning their old neighbors into slaves, forcing them to work their fields.
Messenia became the free breadbasket for Sparta, which meant that the Spartan upper military class could devote their entire existence to military training and defense of the realm.
The whole of Spartan society became dependent on slavery. 8,000 Spartan overlords suppressed 250,000 slaves. These were the Helots. Drastically outnumbered, the Spartans faced the constant threat of a Helot uprising.
They did revolt at least 3 times, and that's the great Achilles heel of Sparta. They've got 250,000 people that want to liberate themselves from Sparta, and the other 1,500 city-states recognize that.
The Spartans devised a whole system of Helot repression that included murder.
They were prepared to knock off any of the Helots that they noticed being particularly uppity. And this was done legitimately. It was part of the system.
A ritualized declaration of war on the Helots legitimized their murder by the Spartans.
Every year, the Spartans declared war on the Helots. They'd no intention of killing them. Their economy rested on the Helots, and so did a lot of their love lives. But it had to be religiously permissible to kill a Helot. And the great time for doing that was at night, because that was the time of greatest terror. The Spartans were connoisseurs of terror, and the Helots had to be intimidated.
At night, young Spartans patrolled in death squads. The faceless assassins were known as the Crypteia. But keeping the Helots in check would soon become secondary to the trouble unfolding across the sea. A revolution was taking place, and in its wake would come the events for which King Leonidas and his men would one day become famous. Greek city-states on the Ionian coast were rebelling against their mighty Persian rulers. The Ionians went to Sparta to ask for help. But keeping the Helots under control was more important than taking on a distant empire. The Spartans stayed at home.
They were constantly scared of Helot revolts. And this meant that they were very shy indeed of doing any kind of foreign policy, of any kind of foreign adventurism.
But Athens, Sparta's greatest rival, was not so conservative. In a move that would prove reckless, they helped the Ionian Greeks burn the Persian city of Sardis to the ground. Such audacity was bound to provoke a Persian retaliation. News of the insult rumbled east, back to the vast Persian city of Persepolis. Here King Darius received tributes from his vast Persian empire, which he ruled with an iron fist.
Darius could not, as a great Persian king, sit down idle and not punish these people. And so the punishment ended up with the first battle of the Greco-Persian wars, the Battle of Marathon.
In 490 BC, a fleet of Persian ships appeared off the coast of Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians were champions of democracy. Now they faced Persia's wrath. Although Athens and Sparta were rivals, the situation was sufficiently desperate for the Athenians, like the Ionians before them, to ask the Spartans for help against a common enemy. Athens sent Phidippides, their fastest runner, to Sparta. But when Phidippides arrived, King Leonidas was not thinking of war. The Spartans were celebrating the Carneia, their most important religious festival, and in Leonidas' Sparta, religion came first.
They weren't going to leave, in our terms, the Christmas or Easter celebrations behind, because they could expect the gods to punish them if they didn't carry through the celebration of God's great occasions.
This time, their religious obligations kept the Spartans at home. Phidippides was told Sparta would only send troops when the Carneia festival ended. The Athenians took on the Persians alone and forced them back into the sea. A day too late, Sparta's troops finally arrived, only to find that Athens had already scored a major victory without them. But Marathon was just a minor skirmish compared with what was about to happen. Back in Persia, a new king was being crowned. Xerxes, son of Darius, sought to emulate the expansionist ambitions of his father's reign. Herodotus records his declaration.
It was by taking risks that my ancestors brought us to where we stand today. We, therefore, are following in the footsteps of our fathers. We shall conquer all Europe, and we shall return home in triumph.
Xerxes ordered his generals to prepare for war against Greece. But this wouldn't be another punitive raid like Marathon. It would be the largest invasion force ever seen, and Xerxes himself would lead it. Men from every corner of the Persian Empire were ordered to muster for Xerxes' cause. Tens of thousands of archers, horsemen, and even Greek mercenaries gathered in preparation for a massive attack. As news of Persia's preparations for invasion grew, the threat to Greek civilization could no longer be ignored. Leonidas went north to Corinth to meet a group of his Greek rivals.
Their immediate thought was how to save their skins, and Greeks being Greeks at that time, what they would have thought was, how can I save my city?
Leonidas knew that Sparta's basic instinct to withdraw to its homeland wouldn't work against Xerxes.
It probably would have been very tempting for the Spartans when faced with these unimaginably large numbers from the Persian Empire to defend just their home territory. But they had no worthwhile fleet. Sparta could be surrounded by an enemy who landed from the sea. Sparta had to have an ally with a big fleet, and that meant Athens.
For Athens to help Sparta, Leonidas would have to come to an agreement with his former enemy. But although he was willing to lead a small alliance of Greek states against the Persians, he did not have the authority to provide the troops to support them. Over the coming weeks, he would have to convince his Spartans of the need for the Greeks to work together.
If you were a Spartan and one of your kings came back and said they want us to march over 250 miles to the north and stop the Persians, whom they had never seen before, to save Greeks that they didn't know very well, most of them would have probably said no. The Spartans considered themselves separate, unique, special. The idea that they would even fight alongside other peoples, other Greeks, was a new concept.
But by now it was becoming clear just how great the threat was.
There's a story about two Greek spies who obviously weren't very professional. They were caught. And what Xerxes did, in his absolute confidence, was to show them round.
nothing could have prepared the spies for the sight of the Persian army.
They would have seen the place of gathering of this massive, I believe it's well over 50 different nationality imperial army.
When they'd seen the enormous preparations, they would go back and tell the people back home, oh, you might as well give in. You know, this is a juggernaut. This is too big for any of us.
With 4 years of preparations complete, Xerxes finally embarked on his invasion. Entering Greece from the north, he hoped to sweep down the coast, shadowed by his Persian fleet. But first, he had to cross the Hellespont Strait between Europe and Asia Minor. Xerxes simply ordered that the Hellespont be bridged. His engineers lashed together hundreds of boats.
This was unheard of. It was just absurd in the eyes of a Greek. But for the Persians, it was part and parcel of the whole army work, that there were people who could provide anything that was necessary to shift an army as efficiently as possible. And if that required a bridge across the Hellespont, that was done.
2 huge bridges were floated, both over 2 miles long. But just as the task was complete, the gods, or at least nature, intervened. Herodotus records that a sudden violent storm turned the boats to matchwood. He writes that Xerxes was so enraged, he had the Hellespont whipped and branded with a hot iron. But the resources of the Persian Empire were limitless. Within a month, the Hellespont was bridged again.
Xerxes had everything going for him. He did not face a concerted military attempt to block him at the bridgehead, which would have created real problems for him. He crossed completely unopposed.
Nothing now stood between Xerxes and mainland Greece. As the Persian threat loomed ever closer to Sparta, it's said that King Leonidas went to ask the gods for help in defeating Xerxes. He went north to consult the country's most potent religious symbol, the oracle at Delphi.
The Delphic oracle is the most sacred seat of prophecy in the entire Greek world. When the Spartan king visited the oracle, he would have been surrounded by a huge entourage. This would have been an incredibly exciting and intense and semi-public event, so they would have all have been there, desperate to know what the oracle said. The whole experience was heightened by the preparatory rituals that went on beforehand, a sacrifice, scattered water, and a pathway down some secret steps into a subterranean prophetic chamber.
Leonidas went to hear the most important prophecy of his life. It came from the god Apollo, speaking through a revered priestess.
Steam or smoke arose around her, and then she went into some kind of trance or hypnotic state and uttered the most extraordinary noises. They're often referred to as noises like a dog barking or growling, which are then, in fact, interpreted by male priests of Apollo to the visitor.
Herodotus relates what the oracle prophesied for Leonidas, but the prophecy was disastrous.
Hear your fate, O dwellers in Sparta of the wide spaces. Either your famed great town must be sacked by Persia's sons, or the whole of Sparta shall mourn the death of a king of the house of Heracles.
When Leonidas consulted the oracle, the news was terrible. The Delphic oracle simply said, either a Spartan king must die, or Sparta itself will fall.
If Leonidas was going to fight, he would have to act soon. Xerxes' vast army was thundering through Greece, crushing anyone who stood in their way.
There's little doubt that a provincial Greek used to armies of a few thousand would have been gobsmacked when he watched the passage of the army of Xerxes, which would have taken days just to walk past one spot.
City-states in the north quickly capitulated. As Xerxes took their offerings of earth and water, in desperation, Leonidas and his southern allies constructed a plan to stop the Persian invasion in central Greece.
They came up with the battle plan of holding the line of Artemisium by sea connected with Thermopylae by land, and it was a good plan.
A line was drawn across Greece. Leonidas swore to stop Xerxes' army at the coastal path of Thermopylae. He would be protected from sea attack by the Athenian fleet at Artemisium. Thermopylae was the threshold to Greece. Xerxes had to march through here to get to Athens and the south.
Thermopylae was known to the Greeks as a strategic point in the north-south land route, and local communities had used it to resist attacks from their neighbours to the immediate north. So it would have been well known as an obvious place to make a stand.
But Leonidas had yet to persuade the Spartans to send troops to Thermopylae. The next Carnea festival was imminent, and fighting would be forbidden under Spartan warrior code.
There must have been some notion that if there's going to be a land battle in Greece, the crack army that prides itself in martial virtue should be there. The fact that the Spartans weren't there at Marathon was only to their shame for the past decades. So I think Leonidas must have wanted to try to convince his people, we can't have another east-west confrontation in Greece and not be there.
As 250,000 Persians descended on Greece, all that stood in their way was Leonidas' Spartans, and they would allow him just 300 troops. The two forces would meet at Thermopylae, the gates of fire, and on the outcome would hang the fate of Western democracy itself.